evolution of Black psychology that began as a Black psychology. Now, Black psychology, I think of as having begun in reaction to what we had learned about identifying who we were. And when I say what we had learned as captives within a Euro-American, a European frame of reference, a European definition of what was reality, what was real, and what it meant to be human. And so our introduction to psychology then was reacting to that. So we had to kind of deconstruct that. And that deconstruction says, okay, we must no longer see ourselves as we were defined by this other perspective, which is not our own perspective, and therefore we need to identify it as a perspective that in fact identifies who we are. And so at the level of a kind of political confrontation, it became kind of Black psychology. So it became a kind of a liberation tool. How do we kind of free the captives from this alien perspective of defining themselves?
Black psychology, it's a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum is Africa. And then a writer has to decide how deep he wants to go into the foundation of Africa to understand these brothers in Oakland today. And some go all the way back to ancient Egypt, and some pick it up more when we come here to the States. But it's all part of one model, I'd say, that has different variations.
My Black psychology also has a cultural component because it's only from the cultural grounding of what I call the wisdom tradition of African deep thought that conception of Black makes sense. So African psychology would be inclusive of Black psychology based on my definition, but African psychology, I think in most people's mind's eye, again speaks to a particular cultural orientation, of which my definition could be a part.
Black psychology within that vein generally refers to psychology related to the African American experience in some camps of the Black psychology community. And African American psychology, of course, would be used interchangeably with that usage of Black psychology. And of course, African psychology, the way I use it, has a global scope, in terms of ethnicity and racial application.
The further you go back into the African...
So, welcome back once again, Joseph Wood, Professor Carl Tone Jones, Patrick Irvin, Breakdown Friday. www.ontheshouldersone.com is the website. You can support me with on Patreon, patreon.com/OTSOG. All my supportive links are in the bio. So we're talking about Black psychology today, and this is something I literally have a degree in Black psychology. I studied this at FAMU. The gentleman who was just talking before this gentleman started talking, that's Dr. Kobe Cambone. This is his book. He is the first person I've ever learned anything about Black psychology from. Real thick book, and I need to read it again. It's been a while. But I've literally had this book since I was 18 years old. But talking about what is Black psychology, and started off with Dr. Naeem Akbar. If you've read Dr. Naeem Akbar's work, you're kind of familiar with the scope that he would come from, especially from a liberation standpoint of recreating the Black mind in the West or anywhere in the world, recreating the Black mind that has been shaped initially by the European. So Black psychology is something that was created to help combat and reconstruct Black minds. If we think about what psychology is from a Western European standpoint, psychology is the study of human behavior. So if we're using that study of human behavior, Black psychology would be the study of the behavior of Black people or African people throughout the world. So I want to start there. Go ahead. I'm gonna throw it to PC first on this one. What's your thoughts on Black psychology, and is Black psychology needed?
Well, we definitely need a different sort of framework when you want to talk about just the experiences of Black people alone. black people, if in whether you want to talk about black people here or anywhere in the world, black people have to deal with a type of colonialism that created set generational traumas that that have not been rectified. So we need to study needs to be done in order to identify the precursors to create that for black people. And then we have to look for, I think we have to deal with the different, the diversities within the diaspora in terms of creating a methodology in terms of study in regards to what people may be going through, their issues, their behaviors, based on how colonialism affected them in the different regions of the world. So I think it's very necessary, because to study black people through the lens of a European is a disservice, and you won't get an accurate, an accurate diagnosis. You won't get an accurate fix on what actually black people are dealing with. So if you don't know what the problem is, or you don't know what the cause, how do you know how to fix it?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So, and we have cultural, things that we've done in the past to address issues, psychologically speaking, in our own communities. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I think the need to actually create that is necessary, and I also think, like it's up to us to do it. So I'm gonna leave it at that for now.
All right, Pat. What's your ideas and thoughts about black psychology, and do black people in America, black people anywhere in the world need a black psychology?
Black people in America definitely do. uh, because I think every group needs, I guess we need a larger discourse happening for the description of human behavior in the larger diaspora. But we do need specific people focused on specific groups, and black people need that. Black people in America need that more than ever, given our origin story and all of the social programming that has thus affected us psychologically. And undoing all of that is going to be the job of not just black psychologists, but black sociologists, black anthropologists, um, and all of those other, ology people that study human society. So, yeah. And anybody that says that we don't need black psychology specifically is a goddamn idiot.
They're
You're not paying
crazy.
attention. You're not paying attention to what's going on around us, what has happened to black people. I want to read this. This is from the name of Dr. Cambone's book is African Black Psychology in the African Context, an African-Centered Approach. Says our problem of worldwide European supremacy domination over Africans is essentially a psychological problem in nature, and yet we as a race are virtually ignorant of this field of study and analysis. This is largely the legacy of the cultural oppression of African people in America, in Africa, and throughout the world. Thus, the liberation of African people ultimately requires a psychological solution at its foundation, i.e., in the broader sense of cultural restoration. And even though Africans brought psychological paradigms into the world, it is most ironic that all of the peoples of the planet, Africans at the present time, seem to be the least psychologically knowledgeable and adept in the relation to this problem. Sounds familiar. Sounds familiar. And I haven't read this book since I was 18. Sounds familiar. We ain't just out here just making up stuff, huh?
And you know what? Real quick, I want to even to that, right? Like, I know a lot of people don't like W.B. Du Bois, especially in the conscious community. But we got to give him credit. He was one of the first people, the first people to come along and specifically study black behavior, black mentalities, black things, and that's something that we as black people need to pay attention to. Not the fact that he graduated from a PWI, like we shouldn't give a fuck about that. Let white people celebrate that. But he was somebody that came along and said, no, we need to focus a lot of these new techniques and methods and things of that nature specifically on understanding black people and the problems that black people have in America. And a lot of his early work was based on the study of people right there in your hometown of Philadelphia,
Yeah,
PC.
the
So,
Philadelphia Negro. Yeah.
so and those are studies and experiments and stuff that we need to be reading up on and progressing. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, nah, it's funny you say that. Somebody went off on WEV, the boys in the comments. They left a long dissertation about him, and it was funny.
I
But
am
let's get
so tired
yeah,
of Negroes and their dogmatic ways of looking at things instead of always wanting to be the film critic or something of that nature instead of identifying what we can learn from his person and history. It's
right,
just waste of fucking time.
right. But let's go ahead and get back in it because we got plenty of time to chat. So let's do it. Come on now.
Experience or the African ethos, the more you are trying to find a source of original strengths and values that did not emanate from the American experience. So while the American experience is long, it's rich, it has its strengths, but the original values and foundations of people of African descent who live in America came from Africa.
In my work, I actually use I combine the terms black and African, or I link them. So I use African/black psychology to indicate that I'm not only referring to the psychological experience of African Americans or the psychological experience of North Americans, but the psychological experience of diasporian Africans as well as continental Africans, understanding that there may be some contextual variation and even some philosophical variation because of the context, but at the core that the worldview principles would be relatively the same, across the geographic and national boundaries.
As we move from kind of deconstructing that paradigm or deconstructing those assumptions to begin to reconstruct how it was we defined ourselves before our captivity, I think the way that we identified that reconstruction process was to call it African psychology. So I don't like to think of it as being antithetical. I simply see it as being the evolution. It's the older brother, the older sister. It's a more matured perspective of what began as a kind of a reactive form that came to be a kind of a reconstructing of defining ourselves for ourselves from our own ontological perspective.
To me, African psychology was about essentially a cultural war. And what I write about, in fact, in some of my latest work is that a cultural war is literally an ideological struggle where we are literally at war for the minds and hearts and the future of our people. And so the development of the discipline of African psychology really became a cultural war of ideology. It became a cultural war of self-determination. And were we as African psychologists determined to chart our own future rather than just following the footsteps of our colleagues in European American psychology. It was a cultural war of values, and that were the values that are central to African psychology going to read the footsteps that we followed, as opposed to embracing someone else's cultural ideology in European and Western psychology.
Hold up, Joe.
And it was also
Go ahead.
Because I just want to like make this distinction here, right?
Go ahead.
Because the previous elder was talking about it's not antithetical, and in fact, that is exactly what it's become in practicality. The practical use of it.
What the psychology has become today in 2023.
Yeah, like there is a large gulf between the Black conscious community, which is kind of the lens that everybody views. Most Black people get all of their Black history information and their Black psychology through
From
the
the conscious
lens of the
community.
Black conscious community.
Right.
And that does not go hand in hand with a lot of what the Black psychology scholars and things of that nature would say. And so there's a disconnect there, but there's also a disconnect in the fact that um Black all forms of Black study, right, have been in their infancy, in my opinion, for a little bit too long. And what I mean by that is everybody's a generalist when you first start something.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's learning about everything.
Mm-hmm.
We've been learning about everything for the last 50, 60, no, damn near 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
Black people in America specifically, but I'm sure all over the diaspora, but in America specifically, we need more specialists. People that are not trying to gain all of the information about all of the people in every field. But in understanding that we need more specialists, that also means we need those specialists to understand their lane, their place on the road, and how to work together with other people. It's like me, right? I view myself as a Black nationalist, but I don't view Pan Africanism as a enemy of Black nationalism. I
Right.
view it
It's
as I view it as a step. Pan
right.
Africanism to me is a larger worldview. Black nationalism to me fits inside of that worldview.
Well, I'm always talking about different pieces of the puzzle.
Right.
And but listening to all the scholars talk, this is, yeah, I know it's what I talk about, and I know I incorporate the psychology into the history because that's how I learned it. And I've told people about my path. Here's one of the books. You see, one of my professors is on here. So I think the way I think for a reason. Like I know what I've learned, and but I get what you're saying though. In the beginning, when you talk about being what's it, antithetical? I know I said the word wrong, but whatever. But and so I kind of want to get back to that because you're talking about it. Basically, you're saying it kind of took a couple steps back over the years because I'm guessing this was recorded in the 90s. I'm guessing this is recorded
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
90s,
yeah, yeah.
but we're in 2023 now, so we basically haven't furthered the information. What you're saying?
Right. I'm saying we haven't furthered the information, and in not furthering the information, it has become what it was not originally intended to be.
A crutch for us to not move further because we're stuck, and like we've said plenty of times, we're stuck in the basically ain't no nice way to say it, but we're stuck in the intellectual masturbation stage.
Well,
Hmm?
because he said, because I know PC, you're trying to jump in.
No, take time.
No, because he said, oh, because they were all talking about how it was designed to be a way for Black people to incorporate a different set of values and a different way of thinking and to move our culture in a different direction, right? Now, I think one of the shortcuts to that, or one of the shortcomings to that, is that those values, directions, and ways of thinkings that were supposed to be different were never defined. And I'm big on definitions, that's my thing. But it's hard to move forward when you don't know what forward is. So they were never defined. And over time, as the institutions that were supposed to house and develop these schools of thought became
Eh,
more white like in their own thinking and approach to educating kids, all of that was lost.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you have a collection of random facts and
Yeah.
views and beliefs that are disconnected from the research and disconnected from the original intent of what the programs were supposed to be in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it started off in that place of discovery, like you said, Pat. Now, Black psychology has been studied for over 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
You
True,
know what I'm
true.
saying? If we go back to W.E.B. Du Bois, you also have to go back to Carter G. Woodson, the study idea of Black behaviors. And then as you move forward, Dr. Amos Wilson, Jawanza Kunjufu, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. There's
George
been a
Creel.
slew of people who created this, but the one thing they failed to do was to create an institution in which they can actually have conferences to narrow down these meanings, to actually check one another in terms of where this was going. So they all spiraled out of control and they went into this whole pantheon of rugged individualism in regards to all seeking to figure this thing out. And so what you have is a bunch of well-meaning brothers and sisters going into different directions. They say the path to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
And so I think what we're seeing is a lot of them, they didn't necessarily build with one another or build off of different philosophies that was already researched by one another. Like we had with Pax, what I'm saying? One of our codes of conduct, we talk about not redoing the work. You know what I'm saying? I'm trying to think. Remember, I'm trying to remember which one.
A practical application, though.
Yeah, don't duplicate the work.
Yeah, don't duplicate the work, right? So, but we didn't do that, and so instead of building off of one study and building off of another study, like when you start talking about the white institutions, like you can name the white institutions that created the pathways to psychology. You can name them. The Carnegie Mellon Institute, everybody knows about the Rockefeller Institute. You know what I'm saying? And then you have all these major think tanks. We still have not gotten to that place where we see the need to generalize, to create a think tank or to create an institution where we have the conferences around building upon these theories until those theories are actually practical and they can actually be applied to Black people. So that's my frustration with it all.
Well, yeah. And the ball has never, it wasn't picked up. It wasn't picked up from the scholars. I think the generation that came directly after those scholars, it almost seems as if they were, starstruck. And so that
yes,
was
we
no
were,
further.
Joseph.
Well, no, I'm finna get to our generation. I don't think we
our
were like right
generation
after them.
I think we're the generation right after them, aren't
No,
we?
because remember they giving these lectures in the 90s. We children in the 90s.
But
because it wouldn't be like, well, I guess so. Because they would be, well, no, because they would be like the generation before our parents, wouldn't they?
Yeah, it's 2 generations down, but even the generation, see, that was the absent generation of consciousness. If you want to be honest, my generation,
the generation of our parents.
Yeah. I would fit in that category, unfortunately. But yeah, that generation.
Well, our generation, we ain't doing that right now either. So,
but see, through social media, and the one thing I will say, social media made it where it was more visible, so more people are talking about it.
Right.
Whereas in the past, I say the 90s and early 2000s, this wasn't the time. This wasn't a conversation. I remember seeing Dr. Francis Cress Welsing being ridiculed and the attempts of humiliation on Phil Donahue shows in the 90s. I remember seeing that. And then I remember like skipping to, the Cosby Kid generation where nobody ever paid attention to the people that made that generation possible.
Right.
And then we skipped off to about 2009, 2010, and now we're talking about the things that are relevant in Black sociological and psychological issues. So yeah,
We're,
we
we're,
dropped the
we're,
ball.
we're, we're explaining why we are here, but
Right.
there's those scholars laid out the framework, but no real psychological examination of Black people has been done to really, especially if because the goal of Black psychology is to rewire and reconstruct the Black mind to Black liberation, to be able to create, because we had a specific show about that. Like, we had a specific show about that based off of your documentary, a specific show about culture and restructuring the African Black people's minds, specifically in America, to a mind of liberation. So now we're going back and we're looking at these Black psychologists. I read a bit from the book. Black liberation is the goal, but if we're, once again, we're gonna we sound redundant if we're not using the information though. Because I mean, look at the quality of your individual and collective lives. If you know this information, if you call yourself conscious, you've been studying this information, but the quality of your life is not improving, then you're not really using the information.